So many things that I don't know and I don't have answers to, but there are some things that I do know, and that I know that if a jury knew, that they would have come to a different decision. The issue with the ballistics and the gun, they would have found out that the shell casings found there didn't match the weapon that they're saying is the murder weapon. That still hasn't been brought up in any of the court hearings, you know, and that's something I didn't know, but that one of the attorneys working on the case now told me about. And those are like fingerprints.
She never stopped insisting she was innocent. From the night of the murders until the very moment she was strapped to the execution gurney, Frances Newton denied ever pulling the trigger. When asked for last words, she whispered, "No." When offered a final meal, she refused. To her last breath, she maintained her innocence. Outside the prison gates, the debate was fierce. Protesters carried signs, shouting that Texas was about to kill an innocent woman. Supporters of the victims argued justice had finally come.
Justice!
What do we want?
Justice!
What do we want?
Justice!
When do we want it?
Now!
When do we want it?
Now!
When do we want it?
Now!
Reporters described the atmosphere as tense, divided, and haunting. For those who believed her, the execution was a tragic mistake, one that exposed the cracks in the justice system. For others, it was the rightful punishment for a mother who betrayed her family in the worst possible way. But one fact remains undeniable. On September 14, 2005, Frances Newton became the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. How did a young mother end up at the center of one of the state's most controversial cases? To answer that, we need to go back to the night of April 7, 1987, when police in Houston responded to a call that would change everything. Before Frances Newton's name ever made headlines, she was simply known as Frances Elaine, born in 1965 in Houston, Texas. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood, raised by a family who valued faith and discipline but also struggled with the same challenges many families in the area faced. Money was often tight, opportunities limited. Those who knew her as a young girl described her as soft-spoken, polite, and intelligent. She wasn't the type to get into fights or cause trouble in school. To neighbors, she appeared like any other teenager trying to figure out her future. But as she reached adulthood, the picture grew more complicated. Frances's choices began to draw her into situations that hinted at a darker side, one that prosecutors would later use against her in court. By her early 20s, she was already entangled in legal trouble. In 1986, she was convicted of forgery. Court records showed she had altered documents to get money she didn't earn, and for that, she was sentenced to 3 years of probation. It wasn't a violent crime, but it left a mark. That conviction would later resurface like a ghost at her murder trial, painted by prosecutors as proof that Frances was not only dishonest, but capable of manipulation and deception when it came to financial gain. Still, at the time, she managed to move forward. She worked ordinary jobs, tried to build a life, and eventually married a young man named Adrian Newton. Together, they had 2 children, Alton, a bright 7-year-old boy, and Farah, a baby girl who was still learning her first words. To outsiders, it looked like the picture of a small Houston family, young, imperfect, but hopeful. Yet behind closed doors, the marriage was unraveling. Friends and relatives later testified that Adrian and Frances argued constantly. He was rumored to be using drugs. She was frustrated by financial struggles and the instability in their home. Though they were still under the same roof, their relationship was fractured, and both were seeing other people. During this storm in her personal life, Frances made another fateful choice, one that would later become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case against her. In the weeks before the murders, she took out several life insurance policies, one on herself, one on Adrian, and one on little Farah. Alton already had coverage from an earlier plan. In total, the policies amounted to over $100,000, with Frances as the beneficiary. And when investigators discovered she had even forged Adrian's signature on the paperwork, the story began to take shape for law enforcement. A woman with a past conviction for forgery, a failing marriage, financial strain, and now 3 brand-new life insurance policies that would only pay out if her husband and children were no longer alive. To Frances, she would later insist the policies were nothing more than a precaution, something to secure her children's future. But to prosecutors, it looked like motive. And in a few short months, the quiet woman from Houston would no longer be seen as just a struggling wife and mother. She would be standing in front of a jury, accused of being a cold-blooded killer. April 7th, 1987, began like any other spring day in Houston. The Newton family's apartment on West Mount Houston Road showed no signs that anything unusual was about to happen. Adrian, only 23 years old, had been in and out that afternoon. Their son Alton played as usual, and baby Farah fussed in her crib. By evening, the family's routine seemed ordinary, until it wasn't. Around 6 p.m., Adrian's brother Sterling dropped by. He stayed for a while, but Frances asked him to leave so she and Adrian could talk in private. To Sterling, it didn't feel unusual. Couples had disagreements, and Frances seemed firm about wanting some space with her husband. He left, unaware that those might be the last moments he'd see his brother alive. Not long after, Adrian received a call from a woman he'd been seeing, Ramona Bell. Frances answered the phone first before handing it over. Ramona later said she could still hear Frances's voice in the background, sharp, agitated. Adrian told her he was tired, but added something unsettling. He couldn't go to sleep while Frances was still in the apartment. He admitted he didn't feel safe with her there. Between 7 and 7:30 p.m., another call came. This time from Adrian's friend, Alance Harrison. He and Adrian had planned to meet up that evening. But when he called to confirm, Frances picked up. She told him to hold and then never returned. Harrison stayed on the line for nearly 45 minutes, listening to silence before finally hanging up. When investigators later pieced together the timeline, those phone calls became critical. Within that same window of time, Adrian, little Alton, and baby Farah were shot dead. The crime scene told its own grim story. Adrian was slumped on the couch, killed by a single shot to the head. In the bedroom, Alton lay on the bed, a bullet wound to his chest. Just feet away, 21-month-old Farah had been shot in her crib. 3 lives ended in moments. There was no forced entry, nothing was stolen. The apartment showed no signs of a robbery gone wrong. Whoever carried out the killings had walked right in, done the unthinkable, and left without disturbing anything else. At 8:27 p.m., Deputy Harold Ricks arrived after the 911 call. Outside, under the glow of yellow streetlights, Frances stood with her cousin Sandra. Calm, dry-eyed, her voice steady as she told detectives she had returned home to find her family already gone. "I didn't do this," she insisted. But even in those first moments, something about her composure unsettled investigators. Family members and neighbors began to gather, some in tears, others frozen in disbelief. Inside, the air still carried the faint scent of gunpowder, and as detectives sealed off the apartment, the quiet questions started circling. If Frances didn't pull the trigger, and then who did? By the time Frances Newton's case reached the courtroom in October 1988, Houston had already made up its mind. The newspapers painted her as a cold-blooded wife who killed her own family for insurance money. But inside the courtroom, it was up to 12 jurors to decide whether Frances Newton was a grieving widow or a calculating murderer. The prosecution came prepared. First, they showed the gun, the small Raven Arms .25 caliber pistol found in the blue bag, hidden in the abandoned house. Ballistics confirmed it was the weapon used to kill Adrian, Alton, and little Farah. The jury listened as experts described how the bullets matched, detail for detail. Next came the insurance papers. Prosecutors displayed copies of the 3 policies Frances had purchased just weeks before the murders. They pointed out Adrian's shaky signature, which experts testified was forged by Frances herself. One policy covered Adrian, another covered 2-year-old Farah, and the third covered Frances herself, all with Frances as the sole beneficiary. Together, they totaled over $100,000, a life-changing sum for a woman struggling with money. The state painted a simple picture. This was a murder-for-profit scheme. They argued that Frances, trapped in a rocky marriage with a man who spent on drugs and gave her little stability, saw insurance as a way out. Then came the forensic evidence. A crime lab analyst testified that her skirt carried gunshot residue near the waistband. Residue consistent with firing or being near a discharged weapon. Jurors stared as the scientist explained the microscopic traces left behind by a gun. The cousin, Sandra, delivered the most damaging testimony. She told the jury about the night Francis carried the blue bag into the abandoned house. That testimony placed Francis directly with the murder weapon, and it was hard for the defense to shake. Francis's lawyers pushed back. They told the jury this was all circumstantial. No one saw her pull the trigger. No fingerprints linked her to the pistol. They reminded the jury of the drug dealer Francis had spoken about, the mysterious man named Charlie, who allegedly threatened Adrian. Couldn't it be possible, they argued, that Adrian's debts had led to the murders? But the state was relentless. Adrian's family took the stand to deny any connection to drug dealers. They described him as flawed, yes, but not involved in the criminal underworld Francis claimed. To them, Francis was lying to cover her tracks. Adrian's mother delivered a line that echoed in the courtroom. "There ain't no Charlie. She is Charlie." The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. On October 25, 1988, Francis Newton was found guilty of capital murder. A few days later, they returned with her sentence: death. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Francis showed little emotion. Some said she appeared calm, others said detached, but she offered no tears. For the state of Texas, justice had been served. For Francis Newton, the countdown to execution had begun. Once the death sentence was handed down, Francis Newton was transferred to the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, the state's women's death row. Behind the razor wire and steel doors, she lived in a small cell where every day was the same: silence, isolation, and the ticking clock of execution. Her lawyers immediately began filing appeals. They argued that her trial had been riddled with problems: unreliable forensics, circumstantial evidence, and a failure to fully explore the mysterious Charlie she swore had killed her family. They pointed out that no fingerprints tied her to the gun, and the gunshot residue on her skirt could have come from simply being near the weapon. Supporters rallied around her. The Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, Amnesty International, and religious leaders raised questions about her guilt. They said the evidence was too thin to justify an execution. They pointed to the insurance policies as suspicious, yes, but not proof of murder. And they reminded the public that Adrian Newton had struggled with drugs, leaving the possibility that dangerous people might have been involved. In 1997, Francis came close to a new trial. Her attorneys claimed the state had suppressed evidence, including reports that might have supported her story about Adrian's drug connections. But the appeals court denied the motion. To them, the original trial had been fair enough, and the verdict stood. As the execution date drew closer in 2004, the controversy only grew. Outside the prison, protesters held signs, "Don't kill an innocent woman." Others argued back, saying the victims, Adrian, Alton, and Farah, deserved justice. The case divided communities, families, even churches. Governor Rick Perry was petitioned repeatedly. He was asked to grant a stay, to look deeper into the case. At first, the Board of Pardons and Paroles granted short reprieves, giving courts more time to review last-minute filings. But each review ended the same way: the conviction was upheld, the sentence intact. By 2005, Francis Newton had spent nearly 17 years on death row. She continued to insist she was innocent. From behind bars, she told reporters she had never harmed her children, never killed her husband, and that the state was preparing to execute the wrong person. Her calm voice only fueled the debate. Some heard sincerity, others heard manipulation. On September 14, 2005, all appeals were exhausted. The governor refused to intervene. Francis Newton's final hours had arrived, and with them a storm of protest that would make her one of the most controversial figures in Texas death penalty history. The sun rose over Gatesville, Texas, on September 14, 2005, and with it came the last day of Francis Newton's life. After nearly 2 decades on death row, her appeals were exhausted. No higher court would hear her case. No governor's order would come to stop what had been set in motion 17 years earlier. For Frances, there were only hours left. Inside the Mountain View unit, her world shrank to a few stark rituals. She was woken early, her movements closely monitored by correctional officers. Everything was calm, procedural, almost clinical, as if the staff had done this too many times before. Frances remained quiet, collected. Guards who expected tears or panic instead saw a woman who carried herself with the same steady calm that had defined her trial and her years on death row. The rules gave her the option of a special last meal, fried chicken, steak, desserts, whatever she wished, but she refused. "No special requests," she said. That decision unsettled some, as if it was her way of keeping control in a situation where everything else was being taken away. As the hours slipped by, she received her final visitors. A few friends, her spiritual advisor, and her attorneys came to say goodbye. They tried to comfort her, but she comforted them instead, insisting again that she was innocent, that she had never killed her family. To the very end, she held on to that denial like a shield. Outside the prison walls, the atmosphere was electric. Protesters lined the streets leading to the Huntsville unit, the prison where Texas executions take place. Signs read, "Don't kill an innocent woman. Justice for Frances." Religious leaders prayed aloud, voices trembling with urgency. Others shouted angrily, demanding the execution go forward. For them, the crime, the deaths of 2 children and a husband, demanded nothing less. By late afternoon, Frances was transported to Huntsville, the prison where Texas carried out its executions. She was led into a small holding area near the death chamber. At 6 p.m., officials asked her one last time if she had any final statement. Frances quietly shook her head. No last words, no confession, no apology. Just silence. At 6:17 p.m., she was strapped to the gurney. Thick leather restraints secured her arms and legs. Witnesses looked on from behind the glass. Reporters, relatives of the victims, and a few who had fought for her life until the very end. She stared upward, calm, her eyes fixed on a spot above her. The executioner inserted the IV line. A clear chemical began to flow into her veins. Within seconds, her body relaxed. A witness described her chest rising and falling slowly, then growing still. By 6:21 p.m., Frances Newton was pronounced dead. Her silence in those final moments only deepened the divide. To some, it was proof of her guilt, that she had no remorse, no regret. To others, it was the haunting silence of an innocent woman going to her death. That night, the headlines carried a historic weight. First black woman executed in Texas since Civil War. Nearly 2 decades after the murders, the questions remained. Was Frances Newton truly guilty, or had Texas executed an innocent mother? Her story continues to echo in debates over the death penalty, a reminder of the thin line between justice and doubt, and the price of decisions that can never be undone.